Okay, so now we begin reading the book of Daniel. Daniel chapter 1. My goal is to get through the first 6 chapters of Daniel today. One more thing I do want to mention here. Daniel is easily, as we read through Daniel in our English Bibles, Daniel is easily broken up into 2 halves. You have the first half of Daniel, the first 6 chapters, that are basically relating. Daniel is written in chronological order in 2 different parts. The first 6 chapters essentially are accounts of things that happened to Daniel and his companions while they were living in Babylon. Chapters 7 through 12 are about Daniel's own visions. Daniel interprets the dream for Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, in chapters 2 and 4. And then in chapter 7 he starts giving us kind of his own dreams. Chapters 1 through 6 are arranged chronologically, so they flow together very smoothly. And they're all in narrative form. The whole book is in narrative form. It's not like the poetry of the other prophets. So that's one thing I like about Daniel. And chapters 7 through 12 are also arranged chronologically. Now, chapters 7 and 8 happen before Daniel 5 and 6. So overall, the book is slightly out of order chronologically, but when taken in its 2 halves, the narrative, the information about Daniel's life in chapters 1 through 6, and then his visions in 7 through 12, each of those sections is arranged chronologically. And as we read it through in English, that's the easiest way to divide up the book of Daniel, because it is. I mean, Daniel itself was made for 12 chapters, and each of these chapters basically has a separate account in it. Chapters 10 through 12 are all one thing. So there's 10 separate accounts, or separate stories in the book of Daniel. And each chapter, up to chapter 10, is the beginning of a new story. 10 through 12 are all the same vision. So it's actually pretty easy to understand, pretty easy to follow. It's not like some of the all these prophet books of the Old Testament. Again, Daniel isn't technically considered one of the prophet books, but he is a prophet. They're all arranged and written very carefully. Okay, now the New Testament, when we get to the New Testament, we're going to start reading these things called epistles, which there is no such thing as that in the Old Testament. There are a few letters, copies of letters of official correspondence in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament we have a different kind of narrative or different kind of writing style called epistles. They're pretty much just letters or correspondence, and there you can tell that it's not, the guys with these letters are basically just kind of writing them, or really what they're doing for the most part is speaking out what they're saying, and then someone else is writing it down. And then and you can see, like in Romans, I'm studying Romans in my Thursday night class at church. We just finished Romans 8. And there's a huge break. Romans 8 is the culmination of a long discourse which begins back in, really the whole book of Romans. But you can tell that at Romans 8, what we call Romans 8, is the end of a train of thought that Paul had. And then when they started writing again in Romans 9, they started a new train of thought. Actually, what they're doing is continuing the train of thought that Paul started briefly earlier in the book of Romans and left to get on to something else. And then Romans 9, he gets back to that after having finished his previous thought, which culminates at the end of Romans 8. That's one of the clearest examples, but there are lots of examples like that in the epistles in the New Testament, where these guys were obviously speaking out loud to someone who was frantically trying to scribble down what they were writing as fast as they could, and then they would stop and kind of take breaks, and then they would start again and kind of continue a train of thought from somewhere else. And that's pretty clear that happens in the New Testament. That doesn't happen in the Old Testament. The Old Testament writings are all very carefully curated, clearly assembled from other accounts or other multiple written accounts that the authors had available to them. That might have been their own. Some of this could have been Daniel's own memoirs. That they then carefully curated into, or compiled into what we have now as the books of the Old Testament, after a significant intellectual process of deciding how they wanted to arrange the material. We saw this in Jeremiah. And Jeremiah just kind of kept spinning the same circle around and talking about the same things over and over again. he had like his list of topics he wanted to talk about, and instead of like delivering his content based on the events in his life, like as they unfolded historically, he kind of broke them up into parts and just kind of kept circling back to them over and over again. Isaiah arranged his prophecies according to these chunks. You have Isaiah 1 through 6, and Isaiah 7 through 12, and then Isaiah 13:27, and so on and so forth. So he had like these chunks of Isaiah, and I mentioned how it was like a mosaic or a collage of pictures, where you had like these individual pictures that are separate, like a complete units in their own right, but they end up kind of getting put together, all these others, for this big collage, or this big image, you know. And so they all kind of do that. Ezekiel came across like a diary, almost like his, an account of his life as he was living in Babylon, as a captive there in the field of Babylon. And Daniel is writing basically a message to the Jewish exiles as they're about to go back to the land, based on his understanding of what's going to happen in the days to come. And he is compiling that from the visions he received and the visions he interpreted from Nebuchadnezzar previously. And he's compiling that and putting that into this information, so the Jews would have that, they would know what to look forward to and expect as they go back to the land, and going on from there. And so Daniel is broken down clearly into those two sections. But that's how it comes across in English. In the original writings, Daniel has two sections too, but they're different. You have the first part of Daniel, which is written in Aramaic, actually Daniel 2 through 7 in Aramaic, and then you have the rest of the book of Daniel, which is written in the typical Hebrew, which is the language of the Jews. Aramaic was the language of the people, the universal language, not like English kind of is today. It was a language that everybody spoke, or was used in official correspondence between different nations, who may have had their own individual languages, but there was this common language that pretty much everybody knew. So Daniel itself arranges its material according to the language switch that happens in Daniel 2, 4, and goes to the end of chapter 7. So you have that section of Daniel, which is about the world, about the Gentiles, and is written, not just to the Jews. And then you have the rest of the book, which is written to the Hebrews, basically. One more thing I want to say about Daniel, and then we'll finally be ready to actually get started. Daniel does not have any poetry in it, as I mentioned earlier. It has a couple of prayers, but we are now in a new kind of literature here. This is what we call apocalyptic literature. Ezekiel has some of this too. Apocalyptic literature is not really that common in the scriptures. The big example of it, of course, is the book of Revelation in the New Testament, which is entirely apocalyptic. In fact, it's even called the Apocalypse of Jesus Christ, or the Unveiling of Jesus Christ. There are not that many examples of apocalyptic literature. In fact, and it was a very late development. The first instance we have of it was in Ezekiel, so all the visions Ezekiel communicated with us. And we have it here in Daniel, and we also have it in the book of Zechariah. And that's it. That's pretty much it for apocalyptic literature in the Old Testament. And we have, of course, the New Testament example of Revelation. That's pretty much it for the apocalyptic portions of Scripture. Apocalyptic writing is described. You actually saw more of this in the languages and the cultures of the people around Israel than Israel itself. Israel itself didn't have that much apocalyptic literature, just these few examples. It was more common in the nations around Israel. Apocalyptic literature is basically information communicated by a divine being, God, or whatever God you believe in the nations at that time, through visions and dreams while you're living in stressful circumstances. That's essentially what apocalypse is. Ezekiel was living in Babylon. He received this vision of God's chariot approaching him and these other things. Daniel's living in Babylon. He receives all these visions. And first of all, he starts off by interpreting the king's visions, then starts having his own. Zechariah, not as stressful, but he was living in Jerusalem, trying to get people to build the temple again. And of course, John was on Patmos, on the island of Patmos, while he had his visions. Apocalyptic literature is different from the rest of the poetic literature because it's not poetic, the prophetic literature, because it's not poetic and it's not figurative. It's symbolic. It's imagery, okay? And the key is that it interprets itself. The nice thing about this is that Daniel's own visions are going to be interpreted in the book of Daniel for us. So we don't have to then make up our own interpretations for them. Now, yes, it's true that some of the interpretations themselves can be a little confusing or obscure. We'll get to that. But we're not left wondering what the visions mean because the book itself actually tells us. I think I'd better go ahead and start a new video now.